Okay, well, hi everyone. Like you heard before, I'm Noah Isserman. I am at the University of Cambridge in the UK. And I actually like that you said a little bit about your background. So I come from a background in startups that built and had a couple of small businesses acquired, and strategy and management consultant for social justice organizations, which was mostly development sort of work. So mostly not in Europe or the Americas. So I wanted to start, I can just jump in quite quickly, but I did want to mention I'm in the Department of Geography at Cambridge, and just since we started out by talking about Scott and the polar expedition, I just wanted to say that every Thursday night I drink port under this flag, which was found on the body of Dr. Wilson, who was a college mate of mine, or an alum of my college, who was one of the 3 bodies found with Scott. He was the doctor on the expedition. And that's on the wall, so we can remember. So hopefully this will fare much better than that particular expedition from Keyes College. So my title is also a mouthful, but you absolutely beat me. And I was just going to start by explaining my title a little bit here. So it's Government-Financed Venture Philanthropy in Pursuit of National Social Impact Goals, and we're looking at a novel model in Scotland. So we need to break this down a little bit, I think, because there's a lot of jargon in here, and my apologies for that. So first we're going to talk a little bit about venture philanthropy and what that is. Then we'll talk a little bit about Scotland and the Scottish context. Then we'll talk about this novel model itself. And then we'll do a little bit of examining of some of the research that I've done here, although due to some NDA stuff and the fact that where we are in the process and the fact that this is more public than I had thought it would be, that portion of the talk has been shortened significantly this morning and over lunch. But it should still be really good. So I essentially get to tell a story because I'm focusing on the pracademic piece of this. So I'm going to be less theory-driven here and more about talking about an emerging model, and ideally getting a lot of information from this room where you guys have all kinds of different lines of sight on financing options for social change. And when you call something novel, I kind of hate the idea of calling something novel because you're almost never right. So hopefully you guys will have a lot of different information and thoughts on that. So we can jump straight in to a much-used diagram that explains what venture philanthropy is. And I feel a little silly doing this since the book in front of everyone is from Venture Philanthropy Partners. But very, very top level, the basic concept was taking venture capital principles and applying them to civil society organizations or social purpose organizations. By which we mean we take a bunch of capital and then a bundle of professional services, things like strategy, professional connections, and then anything else that general professional service firms would provide, and use those to make a core longer-term investment in an organization to build its capacity, with the thought being that by strengthening an organization and helping it scale up, you can increase its social impact, rather than just paying for more program out the door. And we've already heard about the fact that those rarely do full cost replacement and things like that. So intuitively, it kind of makes sense, and we don't need to go into what people have thought about it, but this is the basic idea. And the really interesting thing here is that it's government-based. So the government finance part at the beginning is one of the really novel things about this. And so we can jump straight into now about Scotland a little bit. So Scotland, right, is part of the United Kingdom, but it's also a highly devolved part. So Scotland here actually is responsible for almost all of its internal social care policy and welfare. It doesn't do things like defense, natural resource policy, national pensions and things, because those are within the realm of the United Kingdom. So, but Scotland has about 5.3 million people. Since we're in Indiana, it's about 82% as big as Indiana. It has about 83% as many people as Indiana. So that's just to have an idea about the scale we're talking about here. So if you're thinking about approaches like this and how they might work in your state or in your city or some other unit, that's sort of the scale we're talking about here. And again, the Scottish government does health, education, transport, justice, and rural affairs are sort of the main things that the Scottish government does. So the Scottish government's a little bit unusual. So now we're starting to shift towards the social impact side of things. And that the government actually has one piece of paper that says everything the government wants to do and the 50+ indicators that will let it know whether it's doing those successfully or not. So like literally the Scottish government has one piece of paper. And the front side of it, this is the top of it, of the performance framework. It says, the purpose, the high-level targets, and the objectives. So the social impact here, I'm not going to go into definitions because we've had some very good ones already today. But social impact here is really defined by the Scottish government in terms of one social issue that the government didn't think it could fix. And that is these young people at risk. And young people here means 14 to 19 years old. And this inverted triangle here, it talks about, so these are the risk factors up top here, which most of you in this room will be very familiar with work in a number of these areas, I would guess. And along the y-axis on the left side here, this is the absolute number of people in that age group who are in that category. So the thing we're really interested in here are these 32,000 young people who are already beyond at risk to being not in employment, education, or training. Because young people in this situation, their expected life outcomes are not great on average. And the evidence in Scotland at least was showing that if by 19 or 20 you're not on a track moving towards something positive, you're quite likely to sort of fall off of a path that leads toward what we think of as a generally more fulfilling life. So this was the target. And part of this work is involved speaking with a number of directors in the Scottish government who were involved in making the choice to fund this. They essentially said, well, we have three things we can do. We have money, we have laws, and we have influence. And money, we're running out of money. Nobody ever has enough money, and we can't throw money at these kids. The Scottish government, Scotland has about 23% of its workforce in the public sector versus about 17.5% in the state. So it is a larger state, but it's still a smaller state than many other parts of the rich world. And so, it couldn't, so they said, essentially, we can't solve this with money. Laws are very, very blunt, and mostly laws further derail these people. There's a lot of offending and reoffending that happens at the juvenile or at the adult level in this group. So essentially they said, so what about influence? And the government's not great at influence. I mean, you can hand out awards and things. But and one of the directors said, this really just means networks and embeddedness in communities. And for that sort of thing, civil society, nonprofits are better than government will ever be at the sort of approaches to deal with this tricky group. And these will be more interesting to look at the slide deck later. This essentially just shows that the charity sector is growing in the United Kingdom as it is in Scotland, and that the largest organizations are having an increasingly large proportion of the total pie. So there are a whole bunch of small organizations that are relatively poorly supplied with funds, and those tend to be the sort of local organizations that work with young people that this model works at. So now we're actually going to look at the model itself, right? So Inspiring Scotland is the name of this fund, this venture philanthropy fund. And it's unusual in that it has these 5 different funding streams, and government is more than half. And we're talking about the initial fund right now, which was a little more than £5 million a year over 7 to 10 years from the government, with the expectation that the organization would then lever that into matched funding. So they were looking to spend about £10 million a year on these 14 to 19-year-olds in Scotland. And I think that this is a little unusual, that government is willing to just give so much power to a foundation without a whole lot of ability to call things back. And the other thing about this is that since they knew the problem, but the government didn't have a solution. The solution really came from this organization. They said, well, we have an idea. An idea is, well, we'll do a bunch of thinking here and a whole bunch of research, and we'll build a portfolio of organizations. And that portfolio is going to be across the country. It's going to find where these young people are, and it's going to find the places where they're most likely to go off the tracks toward good destinations, And we're going to try to plug those from as many angles as we can in as many places as we can. And that things that when you're trying to get people out of gangs, it's very different from when you're trying to, help out with kids who have to stay home from school to take care of younger siblings. There are all sorts of different issues here. And so this is sort of the key idea. But this portfolio is, I think, kind of the neat, innovative part of this model. And then once that happens, it's fairly straightforward what happens from there. There's all kinds of input that goes into the organization to get the outcomes delivered. It's a bunch of money, but it's also a really significant amount of work both from Inspiring Scotland, the foundation, and from a large array of consultants, both pro bono and paid. But again, it's really about building organizations is the core concept here. And then, of course, it's just like everything we're talking about. They'll do ongoing evaluation and do final evaluation with reporting to the investors. And then this is another really high-level goal here that one of their key things is like, well, we're going to learn from what works and what doesn't, but it all gets shared. It's public money. We got to share it. This isn't about us looking good. Although, of course, they like to look good. So there were 6 types of interventions that they were looking at. And just, these are sort of what one would expect, right? Things that happen in school, things that happen out of school, like boys and girls clubs, and things that involve, say, the family. And then a number of organizations that work with the most vulnerable people. But you get the idea here that these were the 6 best inroads that they thought they found. And then the other main aspect was the geographical part. So they had, they knew that there were 32,000 of these young people, but then they had to target their efforts, right? If you only have 22 organizations, which is what they ended up funding in the portfolio, you certainly can't get all of Scotland. There are highlands and islands, and it's a big place. And this really just shows, the only interesting part here really is this top line, where it just says that these were the 6 things that they thought were most involved. Things like school attendance and people who are already not in employment and training. And this was how they did the geographical targeting. And to make this a little more real now, right? So we've talked about sort of the portfolio approach that's put together by the foundation without input from the government, but with a large amount of funding from the government, with these goals in mind. And so one of the organizations is this group called Street League, which started off as a group that tries to get people out of homelessness and into more socially inclusive environments by having them do pickup and then organized football leagues, so soccer over time. And they're a really charismatic organization and really good, and this was to sort of help them expand into Scotland and build up that presence and to have them focus on young people. So that's one of the sort of organizations. They're a little hard to categorize, but you can, it's not necessarily that hard to track what happens to young people once they enter the program. And then here's another one, which is just a community place in East Glasgow. And it's very much like a boys and girls club in that it offers and then with some additional services built on as well. But it's really a sort of a youth community center in a very deprived part in the estates in East Glasgow. So these are just to sort of ground this a little more. Like these are the sorts of organizations we're talking about. And so the main model here, right, is that so when we think about usually how we deliver social services, we have a government and they either bring in charities or private companies to deliver things to service users, or they directly provide services. And the interesting thing here is that this pure intermediary who literally provides nothing but support to a portfolio who then does the service. And I know that I'm just trying to make it really clear how this is a little bit different. And so this started in 2008. It's about £5 million per annum from the government and leveraged funding additionally from private sources and 22 organizations. So those are the nuts and bolts piece. This has grown a lot since 2008. They're now more than £20 million a year and running 6 funds, most of which are fully government funded. So they've moved even farther away from private funding, partly because in 2008 there was quite a lot of money sloshing around in Scotland, and there hasn't been since. So their sort of model has changed quite a lot. But then there's this question of why would the government do this? Like, why would you give £100 million, through these different funds over a decade to a group that you can't control, and that in fact is in sort of the most the most sort of standalone organizational form that exists in the West, right? The private foundation, you can't really touch them. They're pretty unaccountable in a lot of ways. Once you give them money, that's that. So they lose a bunch of control, and they lose a bunch of accountability. You know, that's one of the theoretical issues here that's a little challenging maybe, is that, you know, democratic governments that then provide services, at least you have a mechanism, you know, an imperfect mechanism to change the government if you don't like what's happening. Sure, there are time delays, but there is the accountability of the democratic process. And that doesn't exist here, which is one of the challenges. And also, you know, anytime you give money to someone else and hope that they do what you want, there's always potential for embarrassment. And the government was aware of that too. But then some of the reasons that in speaking with a number of the government officials that decided to take the plunge was the leverage piece. So first, just money. You know, they were trying to get 100% leverage right away, which sounds pretty good to the government if you're saying, you know, these are things we all want to fix. Please throw extra money at it. The capacity and capacity building, and capacity here is quite different because the people who work at this organization tend to be mid or later career professionals who come out of quite highly paid environments. Usually they're often executives or attorneys in finance and similar fields. A lot of private equity people also and venture capital people also work in this area. So that capacity is not one that the government could easily hire. You know, you don't often see retired venture capitalists becoming civil servants. And then the capacity building part is then, of course, what they can do to help organizations. So the politics piece of this is that one extra line of removal serves as sort of a useful buffer when there's not enough resource to go to tackle an issue. Because, you know, every time you distribute money, it's super political. And in this case, you know, in constructing the portfolio, of course it's going to be political. And then when you have to pull money out of an organization and defund something, that is, of course, far, far more political and much more damaging to politicians. So they see an advantage also in this one-step removal. And one of the things that I think is pretty unusual here, too, is that this is an investment in evidence and knowledge. This is how the government was thinking about it. That, you know, from the very beginning, they pay for an organization to really hone in on one issue and figure out a way to fix it. And that then to share what they learn in the process of trying to deal with that social issue. But that's, you know, it's one of the top line goals of government. Which might not be the case if they were, say, doing this through a large you know, services firm that provides services to government in general. There's not necessarily that assumption that you're going to share everything that worked and everything that didn't work, especially. And lastly, there's just a piece about relationships and feedback that when you're a step away, the government can get information fed back up to them from the organizations that are being supported about what's happening in a way that it's hard to do if, you know, it's just about biting the hand that feeds you, more or less. And that's one of the other issues, that having that separation means that there can sometimes be better communication between government and frontline organizations. So we've really explained this thing, right? So this is the summary of what's going on. But I think that now we're getting to some of the questions of how does it work? Like what is the actual mechanism for this? And then sort of maybe more importantly, does it work? You know, that it's the first thing really with this model that I've seen anywhere. And so the question is, like, does this work? And on what levels are we talking about, right? So there are these 4 different levels, and they all want quite different things. So the very sort of quick armchair political economy of this, you know, is like who gets what and why. I mean, they have quite different incentive structures here. The Scottish government just wants to be seen as innovative and okay and not embarrassed. And frankly, this is no money to them. You know, that like in the States, government is always the big one in the room when it comes to social services and money. And then, so in Inspiring Scotland, they really want to prove that what they're doing works. And they, you know, I mean, it's quite clear what their incentives are. The portfolio of organizations, they're kind of tricky, right? Because they're really happy to get a ton of core unrestricted funding and a lot of free support over a bunch of years, but they get the money. So even if the support is sort of actively unhelpful, they'll put up with it because it's a whole bunch of money. And then the service users are, of course, the useful point of all of this, but they don't usually have a very organized voice in processes like this. So it's just an interesting thing that it's quite easy to say, this is bad and it doesn't work, but they would still do it anyway because everyone's already signed things. And so in terms of how they try to build in the social impact measurement stuff here, that at the beginning of each organization joining the portfolio, and the process essentially, they got 170 organizations came in, they shortlisted it down to 45, and then sent them several consultants to help with their bids, because realizing that some organizations just don't have capacity to make beautiful professional bids and others do. So that was another thing that that was part of that. But that each one had a different set of metrics and a different plan, and they used a balanced scorecard with quarterly meetings. And so that the main person is their performance advisors is what they call them in the organization, who will have a portfolio of 5 or 6 organizations that they support full time. That's their whole job. So that it's really quite a close level of support there. And this overhead is about 8 or 10% on the investment for that. So they pull quite a lot of money out of it as well. And so now we can actually, but we can look, it's 5 years in, and we can sort of see, has everyone gotten what they were looking for so far? And that government, put in 25 million so far, and 20 million has been leveraged. So government's feeling pretty good. The money actually seems to be coming, even though that there's not a ton of money floating around as much as they hoped. And Inspiring Scotland, the organization itself, is, they're happy. They're growing very quickly, and they're now sort of the biggest pure venture philanthropy organization in the world, especially that has anything to do with government. And some of their other funds have even more fundamental roles in sort of helping build entire sectors. One of their funds was called Go Play, which purely was about proving that free play for young children was useful, because a lot of people think that that is the case, but there wasn't really good evidence, especially in Scotland. So they built the evidence, picked 30 groups, and built them up to the point where they could contract with local governments to make money. So this is essentially proving that something works and then professionalizing an entire subsector to get it there on a national level, which is, again, just sort of an interesting model. And here are the actual bottom line things right now. And this is from the 2012 report. And their methodologies are quite good, but I said I wouldn't talk about those too much. So they have the support and progression milestones ones, and these are the softer outcomes. They were initially things like going on an outward bound course, for example. We're pretty confident there are useful outcomes to it, but it certainly is not a job, but it should be counted somewhere. And that's what these progression milestones are. That would be one example. And so 9,000 people are actually into formal training or employment so far. Again, of course, there are issues about additionality. How much of this would have happened anyway? How much of this was about the new funding and the new support? And that's still something that remains to be sorted out. And I'll wait till you finish your photograph. Nice. So a lot of my work has been talking with the chief execs of supported organizations, all of them at this point, either with interviews or with a survey, to sort of get to the question, does this work? Because they have the bottom line stats. But again, we've talked about sort of the reasons why it's very hard to get honest answers from groups you're giving a lot of money to for a lot of years. And the answer is that according to opinions of people who are supported, but with me coming in as a third sector person, my money comes from Gates, it doesn't come from them, and that's made very clear. It really seems to be working in the Scottish context in the way that this is structured. And that every organization says they have better systems for recording outcomes, which again was one of the top line things the government wanted to see. And 90+% say that they're better at identifying their impact and that they are more effective delivery organizations. And I combined a bunch of things here because again, I don't want to be too specific in some of these numbers. And I want to say again that these are preliminary until press releases and stuff like that happen later on. But so it seems to be working. The delivery is better, the management is better, the governance is better of these organizations as they report it. And a majority, less of a massive majority, but they think that they are more sustainable organizations and that they're more fundable, and that there's been sort of a signaling effect, that they got through all this due diligence, and they've gotten access to all of these networks, including quite elite, and by elite, I mean, the sort of networks in terms of money and political access that it's rare for a small volunteer-based childcare charity to have. And so it seems to be working in that regard. So like I said, I really focused on the pracademic side of things, just like share this new model. I mean, this is really sort of a story. There wasn't a lot of theory here at all. And of course, in my work, in general, a talk like this would be focusing on one aspect, one theoretical piece of this, and taking it through and grounding it in the substrate of this story. But I just thought it was a really fun chance, and I really genuinely want to hear, probably not all right now, but at some point over the rest of these next couple of days, what you guys know about in this space. And those are some of the topics. But yeah, so these questions are like, is this really a novel approach? I am terrified of using this word novel, but I've been doing it for 4 or 5 years, and no one has yet said it's not. And there are some other similar things going on now. But what else is similar, and what hasn't been addressed here, even in terms of the nuts and bolts things that you're curious about? And then the very last thing, and I apologize for this, but it's really cool, is that there's a little bonus, which is that the next thing that I'm working on now is with the University of Illinois, with their School of Social Work and their College of Business, and that this lady, Wynn Kaur, is actually here as well. So she's back there now, but she's also up here. So if you see her, talk to her. She's the Dean of Social Work at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and we're working on a social innovation initiative there that we're not sure whether it'll end up being an institute or a center, how it is embedded, but it's in the College of Business and School of Social Work. And it's moving toward an August 2014 launch, with 3 wings about education and how to put socially useful enterprising behavior in the education process, conducting research of consequence, and then doing the translation to get that research into a place where it is useful to practitioners and the world, and then product development in terms of actual products and services directly being developed there. So if you have any thoughts about that, since we have a lot of peers regionally, nationally, and internationally here, we'd love advice, thoughts, comments, and and just email both of us if you want to talk about any of that stuff, and we'd be absolutely delighted to hear from you. So thank you guys very much. I know it was kind of a long story, but sometimes you can't leave things out. So thanks a lot, and I would really like any questions or thoughts that you guys have. And we're actually on time. We have 10 minutes. Not that you need to use them all.
I was really interested when you were talking about why is government doing this? Why are they surrendering control? Why are they allowing an independent agency to do something that government has traditionally done? And actually, it's interesting because the way that you described it really reminds me of one of the major theories of the nonprofit sector, why the nonprofit sector exists, put forward by Douglas, and it was called the categorical constraint theory. And his theory went something along the lines of, government will be hesitant to provide a service to the population until and unless it is able to provide it equally to the entire population. And that the government's hesitancy, given that constraint to get into various areas, is one of the reasons that the nonprofit sector evolves to provide various services. So it just struck me that this was a really neat instance of the government working around that categorical constraint and using a private foundation for it. So maybe that might be something you want to include in future iterations of this.
Thank you very much.
By having an intermediary organization, does that permit them to select charities that are likely to be working together and try to come on some sort of common metrics and things like that to leverage the situation even further?
Yeah, and that's actually one of the key things, one of the key results that I stripped out, over lunch. But yeah, and the charities are seeing a tremendous amount of value. Actually, the single most valuable set of networking connections, and I looked at a whole bunch of different categories, is within the portfolio. And something like 60% find it very valuable, like the highest possible level. And there are common metrics, and there are twice annual in the current structure portfolio days in which everyone is invited and all their expenses are paid, and they get together and do sort of they actively look for places where they can work together and share best practices. And it seems to actually be a really significant value add.
This thing about social capital markets, like how would you compare this experience in Scotland with some of the attempts that are being made to set up social capital markets in, say, Israel? There has been an attempt in Canada and Toronto to set it up, not very successfully so far. But it more or less brings out the same set of issues of trying to evolve a common set of metrics. And so have you looked at it in the context of that?
I think you're totally right that this work is really relevant to that. I think it's probably getting applied first to social impact bonds right now, rather than social capital markets, which, like you say, have a bunch of other issues. But I think especially with the degree of trust that's developing over this long-term, fairly high dollar amount relationship, that I think that this is setting groundwork for a lot more risk-taking by government because they have a partner they can use. But does that?
Do you describe it as the precursor to the eventual setting up of a social market, total capital market for Scotland?
I would say it's certainly suited to the bond sort of pseudo debt capital market, maybe not so much the equity side, because this is all grant based, yeah. And I think it's a very different world that social venture capital lives in than venture philanthropy of this stripe lives. I think that the grants to equity or even pseudo equity investments is a big jump. I would be curious if you disagree, but I think it's a very big jump.
Yeah, but in a sense, you can look at the government trying to, given the fact that there are social goals there, or social product goods to be supplied, the government is trying to essentially evoke that transfer instead of through equity, and it is just saying, okay, here are the tax dollars, and this is our investment on behalf of the people, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'd really like to have a chat with this maybe over a drink or an orange juice later tonight. I think there's a longer conversation here. Thank you.
You mentioned some success indicators, on 19,000 young people were supported, 22,000 progression milestones were achieved by young people. How did you collect the data on that? And how did you mark the positive versus the negative, sort of things like that?
Well, those particular data are purely secondary. Those are the data that they use. And the only reason I would feel comfortable, even assuming that even sharing those, is that I'm quite well acquainted with the way that they do it, which is very conservative. That they're very much about under-promising, and in a very sort of like modest Scottish way, actually. So I think that. So is your answer about the mechanism? Is your question about the mechanism, rather, or?
The mechanism and types of questions, because I'm working with a similar population. I'd be interested in sort of maybe borrow and compare.
Yeah, I can. I have a couple of their balanced scorecards that we could look at together later. And I think that since they do have so much capacity on the support side, they do tend to tailor quite a lot. So it'll be different for each organization. But we can look at a couple of the examples, and they actually genuinely seem to share pretty well with others. So I'm happy to chat with you about that. Okay, cool. And we probably have time for one more question if anyone has one, but I know that we just had a heavy lasagna lunch, so I won't take it personally. Well, thank you guys very much.